Wait, train harder? Are you serious? I'd like to see if you'd be in fighting shape after a 20-year hiatus. It's easy to make demands when you're a floating face. This is Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters. Released exclusively to the original Game Boy in 1991, Of Myths and Monsters is a really bittersweet piece of Nintendo history. Well, on the one hand, this is the game that made Kid Icarus a franchise. The 1987 NES Classic stood as the only Kid Icarus until this portable sequel came along, resurrecting the charm of the original and at least seeming to cement Kid Icarus behind Mario and Zelda as another key Nintendo franchise. Of course, as we know now, things weren't quite what they seemed, and that's the bittersweet part of the story. Of Myths and Monsters may have resurrected Kid Icarus, but evidently the Game Boy was a lot like the sun. This would be the last Kid Icarus game until Nintendo finally brought it back on 3DS, an uprising 2 decades in the making. Now, aside from the game's historical significance, what's even more interesting about Of Myths and Monsters is the game itself. And that's because this is no reinvention. The game feels very similar to its NES predecessor, and in fact, that might actually be one of its flaws depending on your perspective. But what it lacks in originality, the game more than makes up for with refinements and improvements. Of Myths and Monsters doesn't create as much as it repairs. If you've never played either Kid Icarus game, the premise is simple. You assume the role of Pit, a cute little young angel battling the armies of Medusa, the evil goddess of darkness. Among the reasons the Kid Icarus games are noteworthy are those themes. The series was one of the first to really embrace Greek mythology to that extent, using the same names and characters of ancient Greek lore. The game's feel is just as familiar as its look. The original Kid Icarus was notable for being a kind of amalgam of Nintendo's biggest properties. It featured great platforming, lots of item collecting, and plenty of shooting. Features that largely defined Super Mario, Zelda, and Metroid. You platform upward, navigating levels that create a really fitting sense of height. You feel like you're scaling these massive towers that scrape the clouds, and for a game with this kind of theme, it just works beautifully. Of course, a lot of that stuff applies to the original Kid Icarus as well, but what sets this one apart are its refinements. First and foremost, improved controls. Everything's been tightened up in Of Myths and Monsters, which makes the perilous platforming a whole lot easier and even more enjoyable. Nintendo also made an important change to the game's scrolling as well. Unlike the original Kid Icarus, the screen can scroll back downward as well. And that means you don't get any more cheap deaths when falling to ledges that are off the screen. This time, the screen actually falls with you. A really nice touch that alleviates some of the frustration from the original game. In fact, frustration, which was a key component of Pit's first adventure, is a lot less pervasive in his second. The difficulty is a lot more humane this time around, and when you pair that with all the control refinements, you have a more polished and even more playable Kid Icarus. Pit's flight path didn't veer very far from his first in this sequel, and in retrospect, that might have had something to do with Nintendo shelving the franchise afterward. But for a 20-year-old portable platformer that follows up a cult classic, Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters is everything you expect it to be. And if you're a Kid Icarus fan, that's all you want it to be.